Welcome to the conversation at airsafe.com. I'm your host, Todd Curtis. On November 28, 2016, a LaMia Airlines Avro RJ85 crashed while approaching Medellin Airport after a flight from Bolivia. 71 of the 77 occupants were killed, including many members of the Chapecoense soccer team from Brazil. Later that day, I had a conversation with BBC Radio 5 where we discussed some of the events around that crash. The BBC interviewer and I referenced an earlier interview with a Brazilian reporter who implied that the civil aviation organizations in Venezuela and Colombia, which may have had some oversight responsibility for this airline's operation, may not have done an adequate job.
3 days of national mourning have been declared in Brazil after a plane carrying the Chapecoense football team crashed in Colombia. 77 footballers, journalists and crew were on board when the plane crashed on its approach to the city of Medellin, killing 71 people on board. Well, Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch is sending a team to Colombia to help the national authorities there establish what caused the plane crash. Let's hear from aviation safety expert Todd Curtis now, who's joining us from Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on tonight. And this is a very complex accident compared to most, because as the previous guest mentioned, the aircraft was actually registered in a completely different country, registered in Venezuela, based in Bolivia. It was flying from Brazil to Colombia when the crash occurred. And certainly the investigative rules that are in place, which have been in place for a long time, will have as parties to the investigation the countries who were involved here. Certainly the airline will be a party, and of course they're based in Venezuela, and that speaks to the oversight of the civil aviation authorities of Venezuela. And certainly it'll be interesting to hear from them what they thought of the aircraft and the airline, especially its maintenance procedures, its operational procedures. And as far as the age of the aircraft is concerned, aging aircraft are not an issue in general, so long as the aircraft are maintained up to the standards that have been widely accepted by international aviation. And those standards are very strict around the world. It doesn't really matter where you are in the world. There's a certain way that aircraft should be maintained, a certain way that they should be flown, a certain way that parts even have to be managed so that you won't have any suspicious parts on the aircraft. And certainly the chain of events leading up to this crash, including how the airplane was taken care of, will be looked into.
Indeed. And is there any truth in the fact or the suggestion from Ricardo there that a failed state, as he described Venezuela, is less likely to maintain an aircraft? Should we be less trusting of a plane coming from a state which we regard as not being up to scratch?
Well, there are several issues here. That is, the government as a whole may be going through some very trying times. But the real concern is whether the civil aviation oversight aspect of that government is still doing the job it should be doing. And keep in mind, it's not only the Venezuelan authorities that one would have to look at, but the Bolivian authorities, since this is where the airline was based. Now, as far as the history of problematic states having airlines that are functioning well, there have been many cases in the past where the country around an airline might be going through severe problems, but the airline itself, because of its independence from the government and its ability to keep flying at a level to be acceptable to international authorities, may have been able to operate internationally. Now, as for this airline, which apparently was a small airline with only 3 aircraft, the only operational aircraft was one that crashed today, and apparently the president of the airline was a crew member and may not have survived this crash. Some of the answers may be difficult to get because some of the knowledge of how the company was run, may have died with the president of that airline. Now, of course, this will be sorted out in full in the ensuing days and weeks. But again, as the previous guest mentioned, and as the circumstances imply, this could be a difficult accident not from the technological aspect, but from the organizational aspect of this airline and this aircraft.
Todd, thank you very much. Todd Curtis there, aviation safety expert in Boston, Massachusetts.
For more information on airline safety and security, please visit airsafe.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.